on the morning of December 7th, 1941, she was giving a lesson. And this gentleman was due to be up at 10 o'clock for a lesson, but her 7:30 lesson was soloing, or was taking his last flight before soloing. And his name is Suomala, S-U-O-M-A-L-A. Every Suomala who lives in the U.S. got a call from me while I was researching this book. I used to have $600 a month phone bills while I was doing this book. And I didn't find him. In the movie Tora Tora Tora, they call him Davy. And a woman who looks very much like Vivian Vance at 40 plays her, but she was 22 at the time. She was in the air. And here's just a little bit of how she describes that. I remember okay, I then turned to look around to see if we were clear to make the last turn into the field, and saw the other airplane coming directly toward me and at my altitude. Okay, she had thought it was somebody on maneuvers. She could see it in the distance, and it just kept coming toward her, just kept coming. I jerked the controls away from my student and jammed the throttle wide open to pull above the oncoming plane. I remember a distinct feeling of annoyance that the Army plane had disrupted our traffic pattern and violated our safety zone. He passed so close under us that our celluloid windows rattled violently, and I looked down to see what kind of plane it was. The painted red balls on the tops of the wings shone brightly in the sun. I looked again with complete and utter unbelief. Honolulu was familiar with the emblem of the rising sun on passenger ships, but not on airplanes. I looked quickly at Pearl Harbor, and my spine tingled when I saw billowing black smoke. Still, I thought hollowly, it might be some kind of coincidence or maneuvers. It might be, it must be, for surely, dear God. And it goes on from there. She tells a great story about it. They landed, she took the controls, landed the plane. Landing behind her, there were about 6 planes out that morning. Landing behind her was Bob Tice, who was the airport manager. The Japanese did not care about 2 little putt-putts in a side field, but two of the planes peeled off that had machine guns and strafed the runway, just in case they were anybody. The report I got, the best I can determine, there were 5 or 6 bullet holes in Cornelia's plane as she was taxiing in. Bob Tice was killed by the fire, and she watched the rest of what happened from what is now the hangar at Honolulu Airlines there. And she'd been flying for 18 months. She was 22 years old. It was just a pretty incredible moment in American history, and she was, of course, still a civilian at the time. She wanted, from that moment on, nothing more than to fly for the U.S. military. The U.S. military did not want female pilots. Hap Arnold, who was the head of the Army Air Corps at the time, I think it had just been named Army Air Force in '41, had learned to fly from Orville Wright in 1911. And they were old school. And there were 2 women who were trying to make it so that women could fly. Nancy Love was working a desk job outside of D.C. and was scheduling plane flights for the military. And Jackie Cochran had been a barnstormer. Both were very anxious. Anybody they could buttonhole and pigeonhole, and any general they knew got lobbied by both of them separately because they were competing for this. In fact, women in the military as pilots might have happened a few months earlier, but Jackie Cochran was in Europe and knew that she could not be the head of it if she was still there, so she somehow got it killed for a while. But finally, on Labor Day of 1942, Cornelia got a telegram that said that the Army was finally accepting female pilots, and did she want to be one. And she wrote to her mother and said, "Mother, the skies have opened up and rained blessings on me. The Army wants female pilots, and I'm going to be one of them." And it was another life-changing moment for her. They went to a base in Delaware. Let's see what I've got here next. That was her. That was a friend's debut. That was the War Bond tour she did when she came back from Hawaii. It took 3 months. There's a story there. The fact that her family was so well connected meant that a U.S. senator could get her out on the first ship when they finally started doing civilian transport out of Hawaii after the bombing. And that was at WSM when she was speaking on the radio. That is Nancy Love and Cornelia when they just got there. Nancy didn't even have a uniform on yet. And look at the shoes that Cornelia's wearing. Those are not military issue. And so there would be 28 women all together. And they dribbled in a little bit at a time. It started with 6 or 7. They had to train for 6 weeks as opposed to the 2 the men trained for. They got paid less. They bought their own uniforms. They rented their own rooms in the barracks. They were never an official military unit. They were civilians who were treated as a military unit. Some of these women had been barnstormers. Teresa James, who I dearly loved, I met 8 of the first 28 while I was doing the book, and Teresa was a Pittsburgher, still had that wonderful accent. And she had been a barnstormer for years. She'd done loops, rolls, all that stuff. And on her flight check, the lieutenant who took her up wrote, "Needs more time on turns." So they had a tough time. They really had to prove themselves. The men were all patronizing them until Saturday night, when the door to their barracks had a line of lieutenants end up who wanted to see if they couldn't escort one of them to a dance or something. And it took until October 22nd when they took their first flight. There were 6 of the women who were sent by plane to Lock Haven, Pennsylvania, near where I grew up. It's small, it's cold. They were making Piper Cubs there. They were rechristened the L4Bs. And the first flight, well, first of all, when they got there were hundreds and hundreds of people. I mean, the newsreels had been at the base when they first got there. Life magazine, New York Times, everybody was there, wanted to know about. This was not a forgotten piece of American history until the war was over. And we'll get there in just a second. But there were hundreds of people at Lock Haven base. Their first flight was a puddle jump to Allentown, but it was late in the afternoon, so they had to stay there overnight in a hotel. The next morning in the rain, they went to a base on Long Island. And that was the first. From there on, they ferried just thousands and thousands of planes. They went out as often as they could. Cornelia would be sent through or to Nashville every now and then. And she would send a telegram to her mother or a boyfriend or her brothers or whoever it was she wanted to see that time. And she loved it, and they loved it. And the last thing on these women's minds was heroism. They had a skill, they had a country at war, and they wanted to do something. And they were tired of not being able to, and they were just delighted. But they would have taken any kind of crap to do this because they simply wanted to serve. Less pay, whatever. They could never stay warm in the planes. They had these big leather suits, but they'd be open cockpit. Lock Haven is cold in the winter, by the way. And so as winter came, and they were up in some of the open cockpit planes, flying at 50 miles an hour with an air temperature of 0. They just couldn't stay warm. And there was one other thing that they couldn't do. Men could, if they had really long flights, men could relieve themselves into tubes that they had for just that purpose. For women, you had to be an acrobat, an absolute acrobat to do something like that. They gave up the idea and just stopped drinking coffee before flights. There were a whole lot of things that people don't think about, the little hardships. And she wrote about that. Let me see if I can find just a little. My time is going to run short pretty soon, so I'm going to do the review thing first, because for all the girls in the WAPs, I think the most concrete moment of happiness came with our first review. It was a routine weekly inspection, so there was no band and no flag waving, but there was a backdrop of airplanes, hundreds of bombers parked neatly, awaiting foreign delivery. It was a quiet form of drama, but suddenly and for the first time we felt a part of something larger. Because of our uniforms, which we had earned, we were marching with the men, marching with all the freedom-loving people in the world. And then while we were at attention, a bomber took off, followed by 4 pursuit planes. We knew the bomber was headed across the ocean, and that the fighters were to escort it part of the way. As they circled over us, I could hardly see them for the tears in my eyes. It was striking symbolism, and I think all of us felt it. As long as our planes flew overhead, the skies of America were free, and that's what all of us everywhere are fighting for. And that we, in a very small way, are being allowed to help keep that sky free is the most beautiful thing I've ever known. 18 years I've been doing this, I still get emotional. So they did so well. with a really good safety record, and they were a little better at men at not carousing while on stops and being late the next morning and stuff. So everything was as good as or better than the men for this first trial. And Jackie Cochran had been given a base in Texas to train women too. Eventually there would be 1,100 that came out of there. And once they were starting to get ready, the women in Delaware were divided into 5 groups. One stayed there, they went to 4 other bases. Cornelia was sent to Long Beach, California, where she was ferrying bigger planes from a manufacturer in Long Beach to Love Field in Dallas, mostly. In fact, they weren't allowed to take military flights back. If a plane happened to be going back, men could take it. Women couldn't because they didn't want fraternization. They didn't want any possibility of scandal, especially since it started with so much press coverage. And so they would take commercial flights back usually, although they could bump generals, which they really kind of liked. And they would fly. It was always the same way, and the sun would come in. A lot of them would have tans on one side of their faces and everywhere except where the goggles were. And so one of the things that they were not allowed to do was fly close formation, even in practice. The pilots were young. They all wanted to learn new skills. And so when they were in Waco on a run they took on March 21st, 1943, they were just gabbing in a cafeteria before they got back in their planes and went. There was 6 men and Cornelia. They decided, one of the men said, let's practice close formation. Cornelia said, thank you. So this is at the base. When they were first there, this was one of the probably Life magazine pictures. This is in California. This is Cornelia leaning on, I think, a BT-15, which was a basic trainer, but they were much bigger than anything the women had flown before. They were really excited about flying, and it was the one they took back and forth to Love Field. It was manufactured by Vultee. It was called the Vultee Vibrator because it shook at certain speeds. And this was taken probably about 2 weeks before Cornelia died with some of the women who were out there. And again, it was so wonderful to talk to 8 of these women. And the only time in my life I have ever done the Macarena, and I hope it's the last time, it was at the Disneyland Hotel in Anaheim, California, with Florine Miller Watson, who Nancy Love called her flypaper because she was just gorgeous and the fly boys just stuck to her. And at 75, she was still just gorgeous, and I was convinced to do the Macarena. I don't regret it for a minute. And so they went up, the 7 of them, and they were headed toward Dallas. And the way the story was told, and when I did the scene piece, the best information I had from other books about these women, and they were scarce, and some of them had as much of it as a chapter about Cornelia. She had not had her own book at the time and hasn't had another besides this since. They told the story that one of the men was hot dog, which did happen. I mean, if there were mixed orders and men and women flying together, one of the testosterone is a dangerous drug, just as a sideline, and really ought to be monitored and somehow dispensed, legally. But so you've got young male pilots, and they'll slip behind them and then, just sneak up, just come up in front of them or pretend dive bomb and stuff. And it did happen. The women talked about that. And so the story was that Cornelia was a victim of that. There was horseplay. One of the lieutenants, his name's Frank Stam, had been doing that and hit her. And it broke off her wingtip, and she went in. That turned out not to be the case. And of those 6 men, there's a lot about my profession that I carp about, and one of the things is that we're sloppy. It's the reason there are so many corrections in newspapers and magazines and stuff, that we don't always check our facts very well. And I was really angry when I found this stuff out, because in the books it said he was court-martialed and all that sort of thing. It was not. He had an distinguished career. And I talked to 2 of the other 6 pilots. One of them said, I've been waiting 50 years for this phone call. He was waiting for somebody to talk about what really happened there.